Welcome to Cash Flow and Chaos, the real estate podcast where ROI meets WTF.
I'm Chad, checking in from the rainy streets and hot market of Washington State.
I'm Kate, holding it down in southern New Hampshire where the flips are fast and the tenants are interesting.
Each week, we bring you market updates, money moves, and the madness behind the deals.
Because every property has a little drama.
Learn from the chaos and build the cash flow.
Hi, guys.
Hey, here we are again. This time around, guys, we're going over state-by-state tenant differences, comparing New Hampshire to Washington. We're going to go over notice periods, deposits, how tenant-friendly, anti-landlord each state is. And then stay tuned for a link for our state-by-state scorecard that'll compare tenant versus landlord-friendly states nationwide.
All right, let's roll into it. So I'm in New Hampshire, and we're going to talk about eviction for non-payment for rent first. In New Hampshire, we have our RSA rules, like in many states, 542, that talks about the 7-day demand for rent. Oh, just a caveat, you guys, we are not attorneys or giving legal advice, so you listen to us at your own risk. Always verify and confirm anything with an attorney, as is, would be anybody's recommendation. We are not attorneys. The notice required for New Hampshire, you got to give a 7-day demand for rent when someone's late. So you can give that as soon as they're late, but I typically wait and I give it with the notice to vacate / eviction notice. You wait 7 days, you give it on the 8th day. So you want to be really careful. I typically do my own evictions. I hustle because I want people who are not paying out quicker. Sometimes when you have it with an attorney, it could draw out a little bit longer, costing you more money plus their fees. I do recommend you do whatever you're most comfortable with. So if you're comfortable going to the court filing paperwork, by all means, if you're in a state that allows that. Some states you are required to have legal counsel, especially if you have your property in an LLC. So there are some states, if you're in an LLC, you can't even be quid pro quo, which would be yourself representing the eviction. So look into that and do what you're comfortable with. For me, I am in a state that allows that, and I like to get this over with quick because I want my money flowing. So I'm going to do it myself. You want to be very careful if you are going to go at it yourself that your notices and your date lines, your dates are 100% accurate. Like the whole saying goes, like, measure twice, cut once. Like, double check your shit, because I've been in a situation where I messed up by 1 day and it cost me thousands of dollars because I extended the eviction period. So I had to go back to square one. So that's something I learned early on. So if you have a 7-day notice to quit period, you don't go until the 8th day. So if it's the 1st, you count on a calendar. The 2nd is day 1. The 3rd is day 2. Along like that. On the day that's the 8th day, you go drop the notices. Like, you're better off being off by a day than having to go back to square one, and it costs you like another 30 to 60 days. I can't highlight the importance of that enough. The court filing. Typically, if you give them that notice, it gives them 7 more days to pay if it's for a non-payment. So you give them until the day 15 typically, and then you go to the courthouse and then you file the paperwork. They can walk you through, or your state should have guidelines on their court website of what paperwork you need to file. The clerks have always been very friendly and they can help you. They cannot give you legal advice, but they can advise you the paperwork that you would need to submit. So just read through that carefully. You always want to keep a copy, and you typically want to make 2 copies and give one to your tenant and keep one for yourself. I will literally videotape me walking up to the door and knocking on it, handing it to them, or at minimum timestamp the paperwork on the door, just to make sure there's no, oh, I never got that type of situation, because I have had them try to say that before. And typically cure is allowed within the tenant pay notice period. If you have subsidized housing, which I do have Section 8 housing, there is, I think it went into effect in COVID, but now they have 30 days to pay their portion, which does kind of suck, but there's pros and cons to that, which we can go into in another episode. But you definitely want to adhere to those laws. It depends on, there's a Murphy law. If you don't have many properties, if you're under a certain amount, or if you live in the property, it can change things. If you're over a certain amount of properties and or you don't live in them, you typically have to adhere to the 30-day requirement for those subsidized housing tenants. And if you have now one tenant in a building that you receive subsidy from, so you're accepting government money, it typically is an umbrella now to the entire building. So if you have one tenant in a 4-unit building that receives a subsidy, you now have to, and double check the law on this, but it did go into effect, I think, in the past couple of years. That applies now to everybody, even if they're not receiving a Section 8 housing choice voucher. And the typical timeline, if it's uncontested by the tenant, is 3 to 6 weeks to get them, from the very start to be the sheriff showing up and doing the lockout. I have a little bit of a better time frame than that just because I do it myself. So I'm there, the moment that it's not paid or the moment I could file something, I'm going that day. If you have it with an attorney, it might be more along the lines of that 6-week timeline. So just always prepare for the worst case scenario and have those reserves ready so you can pay your mortgage. If it is contested, it could be on the longer end, 6 to 10 weeks. So sometimes, the tenants might go in there and try to, have the hearing. That's going to delay it a little bit more. They're going to give them 7 to 10 days to respond and all those types of things. So the reality is New Hampshire is one of the faster states and landlord-friendly states in New England. And I'll let one of the takeaways here too is definitely the New Hampshire courts will be pretty quick and efficient if your paperwork is clean. So you always want to make sure that you have everything filled out correctly. They also have a couple in New Hampshire anyway, lines you need to sign, and it's a little weird because you think you've signed it, but then right below there'll be a small signature. So just double check and make sure you don't miss anything if you're doing it yourself. And if you want to go on to Washington, Chad, talk a little bit about Washington State.
Yeah, yeah. I'll keep my
It
comments.
sucks.
Yeah, beautiful outdoors. The rest of it can burn. So our notice requirement, 14-day pay or vacate. Cure is allowed here as well. Court file after the 14th or like Kay said on day 15. Your typical timeline here, if it's a perfect world, it'd be 2 to 4 months, which is very unheard of. Most of most investors I network and talk with, it's typically 6 to 12 months
That's a
because
robbery.
it's very tenant friendly. There's laws that back up the tenants versus the landlord or over the landlord. And there's a dozen or more nonprofit that will bail them out towards the end of the eviction process so that you have to start at square one again over and over again repetitively. It's been on the news a few times, but there's folks up north and over by Seattle area that are squatting in a $2 million house because towards the end of the eviction, the nonprofit bails out the tenant again, and he's been in eviction for 3 years now.
Hell no. Listen, that happens to my $2 million property. We're fucking roommates, okay? I am moving in with you. Hi, buddy. We are now roommates. We are sharing a bathroom.
I'm going to that Halloween store and buying a mask. I'm just hypothetically, but yeah, it's kind of disgusting what you can get away with as a tenant in Washington.
Well, what blows my mind is you can go to 7-Eleven and steal a pack of gum and get arrested. I think this is absolutely criminal what they can get away with. Like, then they're damaging properties. You know what I mean? You could lose your house because they don't get out. How are you going to pay your mortgage? That's bullshit.
Yep. And the tenant laws here, from my understanding, you can get someone in, say you have an Airbnb, like, oh, I'm not doing long-term rentals, I'm going to do Airbnb. Yeah. You hope they're leaving on the date they said they're leaving and not turn around falling under the Washington squatter rates and shit.
I think that you might be able to, because Airbnb, I think you might be able to get them out with the cops, because I did have a situation where someone was trying to squat over here. I don't know how Washington would work for that, but over here in New Hampshire, I had someone try to do that. They wouldn't leave. I had to call the cops on them. And then they actually turned around and tried to burn me. They actually did kind of screw me over. They told Airbnb that I pulled a gun on them. And Airbnb locked down my whole account for investigation for like 2 weeks. And they wanted me to provide evidence. I'm like, do you want me to show a picture of myself not holding a gun at my house? Like, what should I provide for evidence? I don't know. So that was a little bit of a wild situation, but yeah. So yeah, it sounds like, Washington is just pretty slow and expensive for evictions over there.
It is. The appreciation's there, but
So on to notice to vacate or the no fault end of tenancy. New Hampshire standard notice would be 30 days if they're month to month or at the end of a lease. They did just start, I believe it goes into effect this year in July, the no cause requirement. So previously we had to give some type of cause. We either had to be renovating at the end of a lease end date, or they would have had to have done something that broke their lease. But there is now going into effect the no just cause requirement. So typically in the world, if you're in the business world, when a contract ends, you could part ways or you can extend if you both agree mutually. It wasn't the case before, but now we are going to be allowed to just say, we want to part ways. We don't have to give a specific reason for that. The landlord discretion in New Hampshire is pretty broad, and New Hampshire does allow exits without having to jump through all these types of hoops, which I think is great because, that's your property. You work hard, you're managing this property, you're ideally fixing it up and renovating as necessary, and you take all the risk on by having these people in. So I think that you should be able to part ways with a tenant when you see fit, obviously in a fair way. You're not just going to toss them on the street in the afternoon they piss you off. But, with proper notice, you should be able to take back your own property.
Yeah. And in Washington, um, it's 20 days if they're month to month, but many cities require a cause. It is restricted. Like ultimately, they passed legislature last year. I think is in the summer of 25, where we are obligated to present that lease to that troubled tenant again. Ultimately, put it in the tenant's hands when they're ready to leave your property and become someone else's nightmare. It's on them, not you as the landlord. So there's
That's
that.
wild.
And now we're gonna jump into what? Rent increases?
Rent increases, yep. So in New Hampshire, you typically need to give a 30 days notice unless they're in a lease. So if they're month to month, you just need to give a 30-day notice. With Section 8 housing, if they have a housing choice voucher, you need to give 60 days notice. That is to protect them a little bit more, and because you need to send the notice to the housing authority that they're under, and it does take some time for them to process it, send the notice to the tenant, and then update their accounting system. So for housing choice voucher tenants, it is 60 days. We do not have any rent control here, and there's no statewide cap on increases. Of course, if you price your rental too high, the market's going to tell you it's too high. So it's very market driven here in New Hampshire. What about Washington?
What do you guys? I mean, it's inevitable. You have to increase rents typically to some degree,
Yeah.
just because of inflation and cost of goods. So when you do an increase, what do you guys typically like? Do you know a percentage off the top of your head, ballpark?
I don't go by a percentage. I will just do like a rent comp using like Zillow or one of those online where you can see what's available for rent. I'll check to see if it's been sitting. So if they want $2,500 for a one bedroom, right? Obviously, I know from my experience here, that's probably going to be too high unless you're on the coast and it's like Portsmouth, New Hampshire, or in maybe Salem, New Hampshire, which is like a direct shot to Boston. It's not going to be a classy neighborhood with a classy building in that price range. So then I'll just do a sanity check and I will look at days it's been sitting on market if I'm using Zillow. So if it's been, sitting there for 60 days and you can see there's been either no applications if they had that toggled on to accept them, or there's been like very few contacts, I know that's way too high. So I'll look for something that has a lot of contacts that they toggled on that they accept Zillow applications and they've had some and it's only been on for like a week. That I would say is a pretty good price range. I also look at the HAP payment standards there, the Section 8 housing payment standards. You can look right online to see what they're offering in the city. Where I accept such a large amount of housing choice voucher applicants, I try to stay around that amount. So that way, we're offering housing to people who need it and it's in line with what their standards are that they would pay. So I typically use a few different sanity checks and comps to decide. I don't necessarily go off like a straight percentage. I definitely disagree with having rent control. It sounds good in theory, but it's complete bullshit. Like, how do you have to raise rent? Like, I'm fine with a rent control if you're also going to cap my water and sewer bill, my electric, all my utilities. Property taxes are insane here. Like, they go up so high every single year. So if the government wants to cap all that, I'm fine to cap the rent I can charge. I don't care. But how can you say our income's limited, but our expenses are unlimited? To me, that's completely asinine.
That's madness. And here in
Yeah.
Washington, like we don't have to do all that work for rents, for the comparison and all that jazz because we're rent controlled. majority of the landlords that I talked to and network with, now it's 7. Rent increase cannot exceed 10%, 7% plus inflation. So across the board, most landlords now in Washington are 7% year over year. There's a raise. They have to, because if you don't, and inflation jumps from like 2.5 to 4% or whatever, like it did during COVID, like you're gonna fuck yourself, and now you're losing money on a plumbing repair or a roof or anything for that matter. Thanks for voting blue and for one time, and creating, giving your landlords a shit ton more money unnecessarily.
Like just mentioning that, like inflation and all that going up, like my water bill on one of my properties went from about $350 to $400 a quarter to like pushing $700-800 a quarter, just the water and sewer bill. That's one bill. You know what I mean? And a lot of people think like greedy ass freaking landlord, they're just like money hungry slumlords, and it's like they don't understand the expenses that are really involved in this. And like just fixing one thing, it's like hundreds of dollars. And I've had tenants call me too, and this is digressing a little bit, and they're like, we don't typically cover washers and dryers, but one, we let them keep it, and we said, we're not responsible for it. It's been left here. You're welcome to use it. If you don't want it, we'll remove it. Let us know if they wanted it. And they were like, well, we gave this to us, but it won't work. Dan does our maintenance. So, it's technically like a zero out of pocket cost, but it still was his time. And it would have been, if I sent somebody out there, it would have cost us probably $150 just to go out there. They didn't plug it in. So it's all this stupid little bullshit that costs us money. The tenants think that's like, free. And it's like time costs money.
Yeah. All right. You want to jump into late fees in New Hampshire?
Yeah. So late fees are allowed in New Hampshire. I typically I used to just do a $50 late fee if not paid on the first. But what I noticed is there was no incentive for tenants to pay after that, because they just got hit with one $50 late fee. And so now I do a $50 after the first day, and then I do $10 a day thereafter. So it does incentivize them to hurry up and get it paid. I am not trying to get rich off late fees. I ideally just want tenants to just pay their rent on time. Like, I'm not trying to nickel and dime tenants. So I do have a lot of fees in the lease, just because we need to try to enforce compliance. Like, there's no real point in having things in leases if there's no repercussions or accountability. So the only real way to enforce things is by having fees. And unfortunately, I learned to have that in our leases. So late fees are allowed in New Hampshire. There's typically no grace period needed. So I actually count the first at 5 p.m. If it's paid after that, it counts as day 2, just because of our merchant. That's how they process it. So in their system, it's looked at as day 2 once it hits 5:01. So I've had tenants, and I typically, like, if they're a new tenant and they didn't realize that, I will credit that back. That's not a big deal. It's mostly just for like habitual offenders, where if they're late every single month, and they pay at like 9 p.m., I'm going to say, well, I've told you before and I've credited it, it's due by 5, it's in your lease, so I'm not going to be as lenient. At 5:01 on the first, there's a $50 late fee automatically assessed to their online account. There's no mandated grace period unless your lease states it. I know a lot of people that, they want their rent on the first, but their lease doesn't have a late fee come in until the 5th or 6th. So in my mind, and in the tenant's mind, they're thinking, well, I don't have any late fees. Why not pay it till the 5th? So effectively, their due date isn't until the 5th, really, because you're not going to evict someone for being a few days late. I mean, it's annoying, but I wouldn't go through the trouble of evicting someone. So for me, it's due on the first. Late fees are applied as soon as it's not paid on that timeline.
Yep. And in Washington, it's exactly pretty much like what you were just explaining on the last bit there, where yes, there's grace periods. So then why there's no incentive to pay on time? There's no incentive to pay, be a fucking grown up and pay your bills when you're supposed to. The late fees are tightly regulated, and I can't remember the limit on them, but you can't just price gouge someone for paying late like an asshole. It's to the point where it's just like you're begging and pleading the dang tenant to pay their rent on time if they are a habitual offender. It's just hope they pay, or I'm floating the mortgage again.
Yeah, what happens outside of COVID times, what happens when you don't pay your mortgage? Well, you're going to get your house taken. What happens when you don't pay your car? your car is going to get repoed. Like, I actually had a friend down in Lynn, Mass, who used to do towing, and for fun on Fridays we would do like repo Fridays, and we would go with him and see if we can load up the car and screw out of there before we would have people chasing us outside trying to like shoot us or stab us to get their car back. And like literally there were times when we'd be cutting it pretty close, but it's like all these other outside of housing for tenants, if you don't pay, your stuff gets taken away. So I don't understand how that's even like, we live in the United States of America. How's that even like, we should have property rights and they're just being effectively taken away by these ridiculous laws.
Yeah. By the must be nice laws. Like, yeah, bitch, because I work.
Yeah. Dealing with your shit. No, just kidding.
And then we can talk about security deposits.
Sure. So in New Hampshire, you could do up to 1 month's rent security deposit or $100, whichever is greater for a security deposit. When a tenant moves out, you do have 30 days to either return it and or send like an itemized list of like if you're returning it and there's any deductions, you want to just include an itemized list of like what was deducted, any interest they're due included in that, and then you come up with your total amount that is due to them. If there's nothing due, you still need to send them a letter outlining what was all taken for security and if they owe anything. So the itemized deductions are required to be listed out and sent to the tenant at their new address. Hopefully they give it to you. If not, they've hopefully put a forwarding address on at the post office, and I'll send it to the address they were at previously if they haven't supplied one.
And then surprisingly in Washington, as far as I know, there's no strict caps, but it is kind of like you're saying, heavy documentation required by the checklist at move in. And then same thing when they exit, you're going back through that checklist, and then you got to return it within 21 days. But it's like the one, like, oh my gosh, I can actually do something as a landlord.
Right.
That's just just
Yep. It's tough out there for sure. So I can do the habitability and repairs section for New Hampshire. There is a repair obligation. I mean, there is like a little bit of a gray area there. I mean, I did have a tenant move in a few years ago. They knew the flooring. It was older flooring. It was all intact, but it was just kind of like your older, what's that, like vinyl tile, like not stick down, but something that you roll out, the linoleum type deal.
There you go. Yeah.
Like some type of like a linoleum. It was just like older, looked aged, but there was nothing wrong with it. And the apartment was priced accordingly. And then they moved in and they were like, can you guys redo our floors? And I'm like, no, we're not redoing the floors. There's nothing wrong with the floors. They're all intact. It's not peeling, chipped, broken. Nothing's, it just looked old age. It was outdated basically. So in that situation, like that would not be a situation typically. And of course, always consult your attorney. But the tenant can't like withhold rent and say we want a new floor. That's not that type of situation. If there's a situation where like a pipe burst and there's water flowing in their apartment and you're refusing to fix that, obviously that's a situation and it affects the habitability of the apartment. And that would be something, of course, that a landlord's required and obligated to fix in a timely manner. So there are RSA laws you can reference for the verbiage surrounding this, but you always want to make sure, what's you're obligated to fix, and you don't want to just be a slumlord either. You want to make the apartment nice, but there are some things that, there are unreasonable asks from a tenant that you like updating a whole floor, like after they moved all their stuff in, when they've accepted it as is at a certain rent now that they're tied into, right? If I wanted to put a brand new floor in the kitchen, like a nice tile floor to the tune of thousands of dollars, like the rent would have been higher. So, that doesn't make sense to me. But in some cases, they can do the repair and duct allowing that. So like basically they can withhold, they have to put it in escrow. Like they can't just like decide not to pay their rent and, get away with that. They have to like show that they've escrowed it. They have the money if it does end up in court. Hopefully you're, resolving those issues before it gets to that. And a lot of things we noticed too, especially during COVID, like there was like a roof leak in one of our tenants' apartments and they actually went away for a number of months. We hadn't heard about it. It was fixed. There were no issues. She was gone for like 3 months, came back. Her roommates were still living there, and then she brought it up again. She tried to do like the whole repair and deducting and like threaten an attorney, but we had fixed it and then it must have restarted again. Sometimes, you test before you do like an entire, it's a slate roof, so it's going to be probably 20 grand to replace the whole thing. So before we go to that, we're going to try to do repairs to it in different sections instead of spend $20,000. So I tried explaining, that that's something we're going to take steps before we replace an entire roof or a large section of it. And she thought that we should immediately replace the entire roof because a drip came back. Well, it could have been a drip that was close by the other one and not the same one, so we sent out to address it again, but she had threatened an attorney. She actually worked at an attorney's office and used their letterhead and sent us a letter direct from her and not her employer. So I had a nice phone call with her boss about that, but that's for another time.
Yeah.
And she sent me the letter threatening that, and I was like, we've been actively, repairing it. We're not going to go from one drip in your apartment to a $20,000 fix. Like, it needs to be an order of operations. I tried to explain to her. So she was trying to withhold the rent. And then, when she withhold it, she didn't like that she got a notice to vacate because we were actively fixing it. So we obviously were of the mindset that we're actively working on it. We're not ignoring you. We're bringing people out there to adjust and assess the situation and make fixes as necessary. And so there's a gray area, and I would definitely become familiar with your state's RSA regulations or laws, and what they say is something that needs to be fixed right away. Is something, if it's not on there, you have to have common sense and say, like, what is it livable, right? If there's no heat and it's the middle of winter, that's something that needs to be addressed immediately. But if it's small things like, oh, I don't know, my baseboard's broken, like that's something that's, you can't deduct your rent, or do your withhold your rent.
Right.
But if you have a landlord that's hasn't fixed your heat in 2 weeks and you have to get heat, you have a kid and you have to pay an HVAC company come out, like that would be something that might be reasonable to say, well, I'm going to withhold the repair and deduct it from my rent. But you have to, you have to learn your specific states, and definitely before you get into real estate investing, that's something you might want to check the state you're interested in investing in and see kind of what their regulations are surrounding that.
Yeah. Like in Washington, it's got a habit.
Habit.
Yeah. The habity bobbity group enforcement and tenants. Fuck that word. Tenants can repair and deduct the cost more easily here. Surprise. And then of course there's retaliation protections for landlords getting pissy with the tenant not wanting to fix shit out of spite. And then here if you're holding the property in LLC, you have to get an attorney, which is probably best just because of all the silliness and the shenanigans and temperaments. That way
Yeah.
the pro can go to bat for you, but it's going to cost you every time too. Like Kate said, you try to work that stuff out ahead of time. You try to hit it head on, and just don't be a freaking slumlord. And when you fix stuff, you fix it correctly. Yeah, and nothing's ever 100% in construction. There's always going to be something off or something you have to touch up later, whatever the case is. And just like she said, it's as long as you're actively chasing that repair down, you'll be fine. It's when you're like, fuck that person, they're a pain in the ass, I'm not fixing your shit anymore. Then you're gonna end up in hot water.
Let her on. I don't care if you have heat.
Yeah. Pizza.
All right, so let's go to maybe like we'll talk about our investor scorecard here, which you guys are welcome. We're going to have a copy of state by state, all 50 states, an investor scorecard listed on our website at cashflowandchaos.com. You want to go to /state scorecard, and then we'll give you a state by state breakdown of, the eviction speed, rent control, etc., and how they compare in each state. So for New Hampshire, the eviction speed is going to be pretty fast. There's no rent control, high owner flexibility, low compliance risk, and strong cash flow predictability. And Washington?
Eviction process is slow, like a fucking snail. Rent control is quote unquote local, but it's in all the major metropolitan areas. English isn't my strong suit. I can rip apart houses and put them together, but fucking words get me. Owner flexibility is low, surprise, and your compliance risk is high, surprise. And then cash flow predictability is variable because your tenant isn't forced to fucking pay anything. Go Washington.
Tough state out there. So basically what it's looking like is New Hampshire favors property rights and speed. Washington prioritizes, the tenant stability and protections. It's the same asset, same rent, but very different risk profiles, which is super important to know the state you're investing in. So, New Hampshire's about enforcement. Washington is about patience. And maybe if you wanted to give any important last minute notes, Chad,
Yeah.
on Washington.
Washington's got city level restrictions and overlays or rules like Seattle, Tacoma, Olympia, the major metropolitan, like where Washington's at, there's the Puget Sound, and then Seattle's up here, Tacoma and Olympia. So if you're in that little banana shaped area of Washington, you're under a lot more restrictions and limitations on what you can do and get away with and obliged or obligated to do and all that crap. Whereas New Hampshire is far more just kind of seems like it's more flatlined across the board.
Yeah, more state stuff as opposed to local. So I think that wraps up our New Hampshire versus Washington talk today. If you want a written guide and a state-by-state scorecard, go to www.cashflowandchaos.com/state scorecard, and you can grab a copy of that right there. Just enter your email and we'll give you a copy of it right to your inbox. Look forward to seeing you guys on the next episode.
See you guys. Thank you. That's a wrap for this week's Cash Flow and Chaos.
From Washington State to Southern New Hampshire, thanks for tuning in and sharing in the madness.
For every deal has a story and every mistake's just tuition for the next one.
Hit subscribe, drop a review, and send us your own chaotic REI stories to cashflowandchaos@gmail.com. We just might share them next episode.
And always remember, learn from the chaos and build the cash flow.